Picture the last 50 people on Earth who could still explain a word in a dying language, gathered once a week inside a single room, and you will have a fairly accurate picture of a synagogue on Broome Street in Lower Manhattan. It is the only Romaniote synagogue anywhere in the Western Hemisphere, built in 1927 by immigrants from one Greek mountain town most Americans have never heard of, and their ancestors are said to have arrived there within decades of the Second Temple's destruction in Jerusalem, in the year 70. That would make this one of the oldest continuously Jewish communities in Europe, older than most European nations themselves. But the community that town once held has nearly vanished twice, once absorbed by a much larger wave of Jewish immigration it never asked for, and once by a catastrophe that took most of what was left in a single spring week in 1944. What survived, barely, is now being read letter by letter in strands of DNA, by descendants racing to answer a question their own grandparents' generation almost took to the grave. Watch this through to the end, because the twist in this particular story is not really about ancient ancestry at all. It is about how close the evidence itself came to never existing, twice, for two completely different reasons, and why one small accident of geography is the only thing that kept this story testable at all. The question is not whether Jews lived in Greece a long time. Records place Jewish communities there as far back as 300 years before the Common Era, which already makes this one of Europe's oldest diasporas by any measure. The real question is narrower. After 1492, when Spain expelled its Jews and tens of thousands of Sephardic refugees poured into Greek port cities, did the older Greek-speaking Jewish community, the Romaniotes, simply dissolve into that much larger incoming population? Or did enough of them stay separate long enough that a distinct genetic signature might still be findable today? For centuries, almost everyone assumed the answer did not matter, because almost no Romaniote-specific genetic testing existed to check. Then a Holocaust-era catastrophe nearly closed that question forever, by nearly closing the community itself. What is left, and what a small, ongoing DNA project has started to find in it, turns out to depend on one small mountain town that never fully joined the larger wave in the first place. The first explanation is the simplest, that all Greek Jews are Sephardic, descendants of the refugees who fled Spain and Portugal after 1492, with nothing older underneath. It is the assumption most people default to, and it is demonstrably wrong. Sephardic Jews did not arrive in Greece until the very end of the 15th century. Jewish communities in Greek-speaking lands are documented more than 17 centuries earlier than that, meaning whatever the Sephardic newcomers found when they landed in Thessaloniki and other port cities, it was not an empty religious landscape. The second explanation shrinks the timeline the other direction, treating Romaniote identity as a medieval Byzantine invention with no real antiquity behind it. That runs straight into the island of Delos, in the Aegean, where archaeologists uncovered a building identified as a synagogue, complete with a marble seat known as the Throne of Moses, dated to roughly the 2nd century before the Common Era. Ancient writers, including Josephus and the author of the first book of Maccabees, describe a Jewish presence there at the same time. That is centuries before the Romaniotes' own oral tradition even claims their story begins. The third explanation treats Romaniote identity as culturally Greek first and Jewish second, essentially Hellenized converts wearing a borrowed label. It cannot explain the Mahsor Romania, a distinct prayer book preserved in Yevanic, a Judeo-Greek language written in Hebrew characters, chanted to melodies shaped by Byzantine church music, yet kept doctrinally and legally within Jewish law, generation after generation, in communities that also maintained strict internal marriage and dietary practice. The fourth explanation is the bleakest, that the story simply ended in 1944, and there is nothing left to study. It ignores a synagogue on Broome Street that still holds Shabbat services today, a fewer than 50-person community that still exists in Ioannina itself, and an active volunteer DNA project quietly collecting samples before the last direct links disappear, precisely because the people running it believe there is still something real left worth measuring. There is no single landmark paper with the Romaniotes' name in the title, and that gap is itself part of the story. Large genome-wide studies of Jewish diaspora populations, the kind published in journals like Nature and the American Journal of Human Genetics in 2010, did include a category labeled Greek Jews. But by the time those blood samples were drawn, the Jewish population of Greece had been reshaped twice over, first by 5 centuries of Sephardic majority settlement after 1492, then by a Holocaust that killed roughly 90% of Greek Jewry overall. Most surviving Greek Jewish samples researchers could realistically recruit trace primarily to Sephardic lines concentrated in and around Thessaloniki, not to the older Romaniote communities that once dominated inland towns like Ioannina, Arta, and Chalkis. Recognizing that gap, a citizen-led project run through a commercial genetic genealogy company set out to do something narrower and more targeted, recruit specifically from families who identify as Romaniote and test their Y chromosome, mitochondrial, and broader autosomal DNA directly, rather than relying on a generic Greek Jewish label. The scale is small by the standards of a Nature paper, dozens of participants rather than thousands, because the pool of people who can even claim unbroken Romaniote descent is now that small itself. The method is straightforward, comparing markers among participants and against reference databases built from other Jewish and non-Jewish populations, looking for both distinctiveness and overlap. The same basic logic larger, better-funded studies use, just applied here at a much smaller and more urgent scale. What the early results show is not a clean, singular verdict, but a consistent pattern worth following carefully. Romaniote participants share ancestry markers with Ashkenazi Jewish populations at rates that argue for a genuine, deep, shared root, not coincidence. Whether that root is distinguishable from the later Sephardic wave that swept through the same region, or whether centuries of the two communities living side by side quietly blended the signal before anyone thought to preserve it separately, is exactly the question the rest of this story has to work through, 1 century at a time. Start where the community itself starts the story. Romaniote oral tradition holds that the first Jewish settlers reached Ioannina, in the mountainous Epirus region of northwestern Greece, within a few decades of the Second Temple's destruction by Rome in the year 70, fleeing or displaced in the war's aftermath. It is a clean, memorable date, tied to one of the most catastrophic events in Jewish history, and it is exactly the kind of round, symbolically loaded number that oral history tends to attach itself to, whether or not it is literally precise. On its own, that is not evidence, it is inheritance, a story told at enough kitchen tables for enough generations that its edges have been worn smooth. The surprising side fact is what happens when you actually check it against the archaeological record instead of taking the date at face value. The check does not weaken the story, it embarrasses it, in the most interesting way possible. Physical evidence of Jewish communities in Greek-speaking territory turns out to predate the year 70 by centuries, not decades. Picture the practical shape of that discrepancy. A community's own founding legend, repeated for nearly 2,000 years, turns out to be too conservative, too late, understating its own age rather than exaggerating it. Two numbers matter here. 70 of the Common Era, the date the oral tradition proudly claims, against roughly the 2nd century before the Common Era, when solid physical evidence already places Jewish life in the region. That is closer to a 300-year gap in the wrong direction, and it means the real trail does not start with a legend at all, and it does not start in Ioannina either. It starts on a small, sun-bleached island in the middle of the Aegean Sea, hundreds of kilometers from the mountain town that would eventually inherit the story. That island is Delos, sacred in Greek mythology as the birthplace of Apollo, and by sheer coincidence the site of the oldest physical structure outside the land of Israel that archaeologists have seriously proposed as a synagogue. Excavated and rediscovered in 1912, the building includes 2 rooms, stone benches along one wall, a marble seat known traditionally as the Throne of Moses, and what may be a mikveh, a ritual bath, built around a cistern. The reveal matters even with its caveats attached. 5 separate inscriptions found on Delos, dated to the late 2nd or early 1st century before the Common Era, confirm a genuine Jewish community living and worshiping there, independent of any single building's exact function. The surprising side fact is how unsettled the specific identification still is among historians. Some scholars argue the structure may actually have served a Samaritan rather than strictly Jewish congregation, and its use may have continued from the 2nd century before the Common Era into the 2nd century after it, spanning roughly 400 years of continuous religious life on one small trading island. Picture the scene physically. A modest stone room facing toward Jerusalem, benches worn by centuries of use. A carved throne, no one today can definitively say which specific tradition it served, standing quietly on an island more famous for a god's birth than for this. 2 numbers, held side by side, 0 certainty about the building's exact denomination, against near total certainty, from 5 independent inscriptions, that some form of Jewish life existed in the Aegean world, at least 2 centuries before Rome ever burned the temple in Jerusalem. Stone and inscription had spoken, in a language of dates and marble rather than of sound. What they could not do was explain how that ancient community's language and prayers actually sounded, generations later, in mainland towns like Ioannina, hundreds of years and hundreds of kilometers removed from this one small island temple. That sound survived in words, not stone. Romaniote Jews developed and preserved their own language, Yevanic, a form of Greek woven through with Hebrew and Aramaic vocabulary, written not in the Greek alphabet but in Hebrew characters, the way Yiddish renders German or Ladino renders Spanish. Alongside it, they kept their own distinct prayer book, the Mahzor Romania, following a liturgical rite found nowhere else in the Jewish world, with melodies shaped by centuries of exposure to Byzantine church chant, yet legally and doctrinally still entirely within rabbinic Jewish practice. The reveal is that language and liturgy this specific do not appear overnight, and they do not survive by accident. A community has to actively choose, generation after generation, to keep teaching a hybrid tongue to children who could have simply spoken plain Greek at home, and to keep a unique prayer rite alive when neighboring Jewish communities eventually adopted more standardized Sephardic liturgy after 1492. The surprising side fact is that this linguistic stubbornness is precisely what makes Romaniote identity checkable at all. It left a paper trail long before anyone thought to draw blood for a DNA sample. Picture a cantor in a small Ioannina synagogue in the early 20th century, chanting a passage of the Mahzor Romania in Yevanic, half his congregation understanding every hybrid word without effort, the melody unmistakably Byzantine, the text unmistakably rabbinic. 2 contrasting numbers. One shared universal Hebrew alphabet, used by Jewish communities from Spain to Iraq, against a fully distinct spoken and liturgical language layered on top of it, found in no other Jewish community on earth, ancient or modern. A linguistic fossil this specific does not answer a genetic question by itself. It does prove the community meant to stay separate, deliberately and repeatedly, right up until modern demography made staying separate almost impossible to sustain. Modern demography changed everything for Greek Jewry, but it changed it unevenly, and Ioannina sat at the uneven edge of that change. When Sephardic refugees flooded into Greek port cities after 1492, they landed overwhelmingly in Thessaloniki, which within a century became so thoroughly Sephardic that Yevanic and the older Romaniote rite nearly disappeared there entirely, swallowed by sheer numbers. Ioannina, inland, mountainous, and comparatively unattractive to merchant refugees who needed a working port, largely escaped that flood. The reveal is a genuine demographic accident with real genetic implications. By staying off the main Sephardic settlement routes, Ioannina preserved something close to a Romaniote majority community for over 4 centuries after most of the rest of Greek Jewry had been reshaped. By the start of the 20th century, roughly 4,000 Romaniote Jews lived there, still speaking Yevanic, still following the Mahzor Romania, still marrying largely within their own tightly bounded community. The surprising side fact is what that isolation quietly did at the population level, even without anyone tracking it scientifically. 4 centuries of comparative endogamy in a town of that size is exactly the kind of setup population geneticists look for when hunting founder effects, the same mechanism that leaves a detectable genetic fingerprint in isolated communities elsewhere in the world. Picture the town itself, a lakeside settlement in the Epirus Mountains, synagogues and Sephardic-free Yevanic conversation continuing on the same streets for 400 years, while Thessaloniki, a few hundred kilometers away, transformed into one of the great Sephardic cities of the Mediterranean. 2 numbers worth holding, roughly 4,000 Romaniote Jews in Ioannina by 1900, against a Sephardic Jewish population in Thessaloniki numbering in the tens of thousands by the same date. Geography had bought Ioannina 4 extra centuries of genetic distinctiveness, 4 centuries the rest of Greek Jewry simply did not get. History was about to take almost all of it back in a single week. That week came in March of 1944. German occupation forces rounded up the Jewish community of Ioannina in a single coordinated action and deported nearly all of them, first to Athens, then onward to Auschwitz-Birkenau. Of the roughly 1,800 to 2,000 Jews living in the town at the time, most reports place the number of eventual survivors of the death camps at only 112. Another 69 escaped the initial roundup entirely, hidden by Christian neighbors or fled into the surrounding mountains, some later joining the Greek resistance. The reveal here is blunt and has to be stated plainly. In the space of a single deportation, a community that had taken roughly 19 centuries to build, survive Byzantine rule, Ottoman rule, and 400 years of demographic isolation from the Sephardic majority, lost the overwhelming majority of its population in a matter of months. The surprising side fact, almost unbearable in its precision, is how close that number came to erasing not just the community, but the evidence base any future genetic study would ever have to work with. A population already down to a few thousand, reduced further to barely over 100 immediate survivors, is a population very close to the minimum size at which a distinct genetic signal simply stops being statistically recoverable at all. Picture the empty synagogue in Ioannina in the years after liberation, benches that once seated thousands now serving fewer than 50 remaining community members. Most of the town's Yevanic speakers gone along with the people who spoke it. Two numbers that should never sit this close together. Roughly 4,000 Romaniote Jews in Ioannina at the century's start, fewer than 50 by its end. What survived, barely, did not stay in Greece. Much of it boarded ships for New York, decades earlier and later, carrying the only version of this story that still had enough people left to test. That is where the genetic testing actually begins, not in a hospital or a university genetics department, but largely among descendants themselves. Many connected through the Kehila Kedosha Janina synagogue on Broome Street, the only Romaniote congregation left in the entire Western Hemisphere. Working with a commercial genetic genealogy company, volunteers built a dedicated Romaniote DNA project collecting Y chromosome data passed father to son, mitochondrial data passed mother to child, and broader autosomal markers, from people who could document specific descent from Ioannina, Arta, Chalkis, and other historically Romaniote towns, rather than from the Sephardic majority mainstream of modern Greek Jewry. The reveal, still preliminary by the standards of a peer-reviewed genome paper but consistent across multiple participants, is that Romaniote-descended testers share meaningful ancestry markers with Ashkenazi Jewish populations, a genetic echo pointing toward the same broad Middle Eastern Jewish root shared across the wider diaspora, filtered here through 19 centuries in Greek-speaking lands rather than through medieval Western or Central Europe. The surprising side fact is how much this small volunteer-run project has had to do the job that a landmark nature study never got the chance to do here, precisely because the sample size a Holocaust and 5 centuries of demographic absorption left behind is simply too small to attract the kind of large-scale, well-funded genome-wide research applied to bigger surviving diaspora communities elsewhere. Picture a woman in Queens or on Long Island, mailing a cheek swab kit back to a lab, her grandmother's Yevanic lullabies the only reason she even knew to check the box marked Romaniote rather than simply Greek Jewish. Two numbers worth sitting with. Dozens of participants in an ongoing volunteer project, against the thousands typically recruited for the landmark studies covering larger surviving Jewish diaspora populations. Every earlier clue, the legend, the island, the language, the isolated town, the deportation, had been pointing toward one fragile but real signal. This is the first time anyone had actually gone looking for it directly. Line the evidence up, and it narrows toward something smaller and more urgent than a typical ancestry story. Legend claimed the community began in the year 70. Archaeology on Delos pushed the real record back centuries earlier than that, embarrassing the legend rather than confirming it. Language and liturgy proved centuries of deliberate separateness. Ioannina's isolation from the Sephardic mainland preserved that separateness for 4 more centuries. The Holocaust then erased roughly 97% of the population carrying it in a single year. What survived was not a large, statistically comfortable sample. It was a scattering of families, mostly now in New York, mailing in cheek swabs to try to answer a question about their own grandparents before the last people who could remember the answer, in any language, were gone for good. Here is what the DNA, limited as it currently is, actually shows. Romaniote-descended participants carry ancestry markers closely shared with Ashkenazi Jewish populations, consistent with descent from the same broad, ancient Middle Eastern Jewish root that fed every branch of the wider diaspora, arriving in Greek-speaking lands long before the year the community's own oral tradition claims, and staying largely endogamous there for roughly 19 centuries. It is not, and cannot yet be, a clean, isolated Romaniote-specific signature, separated with certainty from the later Sephardic wave that eventually surrounded it. What it is real evidence, gathered against extraordinary odds, that this was never simply a religious label attached to ordinary Greek converts. A genuine, ancient, once larger Jewish population lived, prayed, and married within itself in these mountains for the better part of 2,000 years. And enough of its genetic signal survived both a Holocaust and a much slower demographic flood to still be readable today, in a small number of families who thought to go looking for it before it was too late. But the deeper twist here is not that Romaniote Jews share ancient roots with other diaspora communities. Almost every Jewish population studied this way turns out to share that. The genuinely strange part of this particular story is that the evidence for it nearly disappeared not once, but twice, through two completely different mechanisms, and the second time came within a single generation of finishing the job the first time started. The first near erasure was quiet and gradual, the arrival of tens of thousands of Sephardic refugees after 1492, who within a century or two came to vastly outnumber Romaniote Jews across almost every Greek city they settled. In most of those places, the smaller, older community simply blended into the larger, culturally dominant newcomers, its language abandoned, its distinct prayer rite replaced, not through violence but through ordinary demographic gravity. Had that pattern played out identically in Ioannina, there would likely be no separable Romaniote genetic question left to ask at all today, only a fully merged Greek-Jewish population indistinguishable in the historical record. Ioannina escaped that first erasure mostly by geographic accident, sitting inland, away from the ports Sephardic merchants needed. That accident bought the community 4 more centuries as a distinct, comparatively isolated population, exactly the kind of long-term endogamy that leaves a genetic trace. But those same 4 centuries of concentrated, undiluted population were precisely what made the community small enough, in one identifiable place, for the second erasure to nearly finish the job in 1944 that the first one had failed to. A population that had successfully resisted demographic dissolution for 400 years was reduced by roughly 97% in the time it takes most people to finish a single university degree. The twist, then, is this. What looks today like a straightforward genetic echo of ancient Middle Eastern ancestry is actually the product of the community surviving 2 entirely different kinds of near extinction, a slow cultural absorption it managed to dodge, and a sudden physical catastrophe it did not. The DNA project on Broome Street is not confirming an unbroken, comfortable inheritance. It is racing to document what is left of one, before the specific families who can still document Romaniote descent age out of existence the way the language itself already has. If that reframing holds, confirmation should show up somewhere entirely outside genetics or genealogy records, and it does, in the deliberately preserved architecture and liturgy that has nothing to do with DNA at all. The Kehila Kedosha Janina Synagogue on Broome Street was built in 1927 specifically to replicate the layout and feel of an Ioannina synagogue, down to a women's balcony and a raised, centrally placed reading platform typical of Romaniote design, rather than the more common Ashkenazi or Sephardic layouts found elsewhere on the same block. This is independent confirmation in a very literal sense. It did not come from a lab technician running a Y chromosome panel. It came from immigrant builders in 1920s Manhattan who could have simply joined an existing nearby congregation and did not, choosing instead to physically reconstruct a specific architectural memory their community judged worth preserving. The synagogue's ongoing museum and its continued Shabbat services, attended by a small but real congregation, function as a second, cultural strand of evidence running parallel to the genetic one, both converging on the same conclusion from completely different directions. Picture the sanctuary today. Wooden pews imported in style, if not in exact material, from a town most of its current congregants have never physically visited. A Yevanic prayer, occasionally still recited from memory by the oldest members present. Cultural preservation said this community meant to stay distinct. DNA testing says it may actually have succeeded, at least partially, despite everything working against it. 2 completely different kinds of evidence. An old building's floor plan and a modern genetic marker, landing on the same fragile but real answer. The mechanism holding this together is the same founder effect and endogamy pattern population geneticists find in other small, historically closed communities. But the numbers here are unusually stark because of how far the population actually fell. A community of roughly 4,000 people, marrying largely within itself for 4 centuries, would already be expected to show detectable founder effect clustering in later genetic testing under ordinary circumstances. A community reduced from that same 4,000 to fewer than 200 immediate survivors within months, and then scattered across emigration to New York, Athens, and Israel in the decades after. faces a much harder statistical problem. The numbers make the trade-off visible. On one side, a smaller surviving population theoretically concentrates any distinctive genetic markers more strongly among the descendants who remain, in principle making a real signal easier to detect if you can find and test enough of them. On the other side, that same population collapse shrinks the total pool of testable descendants so severely that recruiting a large enough sample for standard statistical confidence becomes its own separate challenge, one that a larger surviving community, like Persian or Bukharan Jews, never had to solve to nearly the same degree, simply because more of them lived to be asked the question at all. It is the same founder effect mechanism working in two directions at once, concentrating the signal while simultaneously starving the sample size needed to prove it beyond reasonable statistical doubt. That tension, not any single missing piece of data, is the actual reason this community still lacks a landmark peer-reviewed genome paper of its own, decades after larger, less devastated Jewish diaspora populations already got theirs. None of this proves a Romaniote genetic signature fully separable from the Sephardic Jewish populations that later surrounded it. And the current sample sizes involved, dozens of volunteer participants rather than thousands, mean any specific percentage or precise split time estimate would be premature to claim. It does not resolve the historical debate over the Delos synagogue's exact religious identity, Jewish or Samaritan, and it cannot verify the oral tradition's specific arrival date, which the archaeological record already appears to contradict. What the evidence solidly supports is a genuinely ancient, once distinct Jewish community, with shared deep diaspora ancestry, preserved through language and liturgy long before anyone tested a single gene. What it cannot yet supply is a completed scientific verdict on exactly how much of that distinctiveness survived intact to the present day, or how it would compare if the community had never been reduced to so few testable descendants in the first place. Think about how easily this particular story could have vanished entirely, not through some dramatic single event, but through simple demographic math playing out over a few centuries, the way it already did in almost every other Greek Jewish community, absorbed by the Sephardic majority after 1492. A few hundred fewer survivors in 1944. A few less descendants willing to mail in a cheek swab decades later. A synagogue on Broome Street quietly closing instead of rebuilding. Any one of those, and there would be no DNA project, no Yevanic prayer occasionally recalled by an elderly congregant, nothing left to write a video about at all. Your own family history is running a quieter version of the same experiment right now, whether you have ever thought about it that way or not. Every marriage, every migration, every choice to keep a language or a recipe or a melody alive instead of letting it lapse, is a small bet on whether some future descendant will have anything left to trace back. Most of those bets are made without anyone realizing they are bets at all. The oral tradition said the community began in the year 70. The island of Delos said Jewish life in Greece is centuries older than that claim. The language and the prayer book said this community meant to stay separate on purpose. The Holocaust said separateness has a terrible cost when it concentrates a population in one place. The DNA project on Broome Street says enough survived anyway to still be worth testing. Romaniote Jews really do carry one of the most fascinating genetic histories in the entire Jewish diaspora. Not because the science is finished, but because the fact that there is still anything left to study at all is close to a miracle of arithmetic. If a piece of your own family's story nearly didn't survive to reach you, whether through war, migration, or simple forgetting, tell it in the comments. Someone else's grandmother might be the last person who remembers the part yours lost.